I know those marks. This knife was in the jungle.
We were both there.
Janitor's combat knife was noticed. Entire Marine squadron instantly surrounded him. Frank Morrison pushed his cleaning cart through the corridors of Camp Pendleton at OR 5:30 on Thursday morning, the worn handle of his K-bar combat knife visible beneath his janitor's coveralls, as he began another day of invisible service. In 90 minutes, when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez noticed that Blade 40 years of hidden honor would finally be recognized. Frank 62 appears to be exactly what his uniform suggests, an aging janitor whose quiet efficiency keeps Marine facilities spotless, while younger warriors barely acknowledge his existence. But the combat knife on his belt tells a different story, one of jungle warfare fallen brothers and a hero society had forgotten. What happened in the maintenance hallway would prove that some Marines never truly leave the Corps, and that recognition can come from the most unexpected sources when brothers recognize brothers across generations of service. Camp Pendleton, California, the sprawling Marine Corps base where new generations of warriors train for deployments, while older Marines work civilian jobs that keep the massive installation functioning. The base operates with typical military efficiency, but civilian employees often remain invisible to active duty personnel focused on training and mission preparation. The generational divide between Vietnam veterans and current Marines reflects broader societal disconnection from that controversial war where returning veterans faced hostility rather than heroes' welcomes. Many Vietnam Marines found civilian employment on military bases where their service background might be appreciated even if not openly acknowledged. Recent efforts to honor Vietnam veterans have increased awareness about forgotten warriors, but decades of silence have left many former Marines reluctant to discuss service that younger generations might not understand or respect. This setting represents the intersection where hidden military honor meets active duty recognition, creating opportunities for bridging generational gaps through shared Marine Corps values. Frank enlisted in 1969 at age 17, deploying to Vietnam as an infantry Marine, where his squad conducted reconnaissance missions deep in enemy territory. His K-bar knife became an essential survival tool during 13 months of jungle combat that tested every aspect of Marine training. Frank's closest friend, Lance Corporal Tommy Nguyen, died in his arms during their final patrol when enemy fire prevented helicopter extraction. Frank carried Tommy's dog tags alongside his own, promising to remember his sacrifice when civilian protesters made such memories unwelcome upon his return to America in 1971. After struggling with PTSD and civilian employment discrimination against Vietnam veterans, Frank found stable work as base janitor at Camp Pendleton, where his Marine background remained largely unrecognized by younger personnel who saw only civilian maintenance worker. His daily routine involves cleaning facilities that train new Marines, creating bittersweet connection to military culture that his service had earned, but societal reception had complicated. Frank maintains his K-bar as daily reminder of Tommy and other fallen Marines, though he rarely discusses Vietnam experiences with coworkers who assume his military knowledge comes from movies rather than combat experience. Despite his civilian role, Frank retains complete Marine bearing and tactical awareness that 40 years of janitor work couldn't eliminate. His knowledge of weapons tactics and Marine Corps history exceeds that of many active duty personnel, though he typically shares such expertise only when directly asked by respectful Marines seeking guidance. Frank's greatest strength is his ability to mentor young Marines through stories that convey lessons about honor, sacrifice, and brotherhood that textbook training cannot teach effectively. His Vietnam experience provides perspective on combat realities that peacetime training can only approximate through simulation rather than actual experience. Frank must navigate daily work environment where his Vietnam service remains invisible to Marines whose generational assumptions prevent recognition of his combat experience and institutional knowledge that could benefit their training and understanding of core values. The primary obstacle is societal disconnect from Vietnam War that created lasting stigma affecting veteran recognition, while generational differences between current Marines and Vietnam-era personnel limit opportunities for meaningful interaction about shared military culture and combat experience. The stakes involve both personal validation and institutional knowledge transfer. Frank's continued invisibility wastes decades of combat experience and Marine Corps wisdom that could enhance current personnel's understanding of service and sacrifice, while his potential recognition could bridge generational gaps that benefit both veterans and active duty Marines. This conflict represents the challenge facing forgotten veterans whose expertise remains untapped. While military institutions lose valuable knowledge through failure to connect experienced personnel with current service members who could benefit from their guidance and perspective. But Frank's carefully maintained invisibility was about to end when one Marine's observant eye recognized the significance of a blade that had seen real combat. Frank's routine morning began with cleaning the squadron ready room, where Marines prepared for training exercises, his presence so familiar that most personnel continued conversations without acknowledging the janitor whose military bearing they'd never learned to recognize. Same missions, different generation, Frank thought, while observing tactical briefings that reminded him of Vietnam operations. Planning, though modern technology had advanced far beyond the maps and radios his unit had relied upon during jungle warfare, his cleaning routine provided unique perspective on Marine Corps. Evolution training methods had improved, equipment had modernized, but the fundamental values of honor, courage, and commitment remained unchanged across generations of warriors who shared common bond despite temporal separation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez entered the ready room for equipment inspection while Frank organized cleaning supplies, creating a moment where Vietnam veteran and current Marine occupied same space without recognition that their shared service transcended generational boundaries. Mourning Frank, Rodriguez acknowledged with casual respect that base personnel typically showed civilian employees not suspecting that the janitor possessed combat experience exceeding that of many active duty Marines currently training for their first deployments to combat zones. The interaction represented missed opportunity for knowledge transfer between experienced veteran and preparing warrior, highlighting institutional failure to utilize available expertise that base employment had positioned for mentoring relationships. Frank's daily routine involved strategic positioning during Marine activities that allowed observation of training evolution while maintaining custodial responsibilities that justified his presence throughout base facilities, where civilian access was normally restricted. His approach emphasized learning about current Marine Corps culture while suppressing impulses to offer tactical advice based on combat experience that generational assumptions might dismiss as outdated rather than foundational knowledge that remained relevant. Most critically, Frank prepared psychological strategies for managing emotional triggers when observing young Marines whose enthusiasm reminded him of Tommy and other squad members who hadn't returned from Vietnam, requiring careful balance between supportive observation and painful memories. His equipment maintenance included daily care for the K-bar that served as tangible connection to military service, while providing practical tool for various maintenance tasks that justified carrying combat knife in civilian work environment. Frank also prepared standard responses to occasional questions about his military background, providing minimal information that acknowledged service without inviting detailed discussions about Vietnam experiences that civilian co-workers might not understand or appreciate. His positioning during Marine activities enabled assessment of current training methods and equipment capabilities, comparing modern approaches with Vietnam-era techniques, while identifying opportunities where historical perspective could enhance contemporary military education if proper recognition created teaching opportunities. Frank's morning cleaning brought him to the armory area where Staff Sergeant Rodriguez conducted weapons maintenance training for junior Marines, learning proper care and handling of combat equipment that Frank had mastered decades earlier. The demonstration covered K-bar maintenance techniques that Frank had perfected through combat necessity, watching Rodriguez explain procedures that jungle warfare had taught through practical application rather than classroom instruction. Proper blade care can mean survival in field conditions, Rodriguez instructed while Frank continued sweeping nearby, his own K-bar visible beneath coveralls, as practical reminder of lessons learned through combat experience rather than training scenarios. Rodriguez's peripheral vision caught sight of Frank's knife, recognizing authentic combat wear patterns that training weapons never developed through actual field use under hostile conditions, requiring daily maintenance for survival purposes. "That's interesting knife you have there," Rodriguez commented while approaching Frank, whose cleaning routine had positioned him within conversational distance of weapons training that his experience could significantly enhance. Frank's response revealed careful balance between acknowledgement and concealment. Old Marine issue still works well for maintenance tasks around base. His understated explanation concealed decades of combat utility, while providing minimal information about military background. The interaction created first opening for recognition that Frank's presence represented untapped resource for Marine Corps knowledge and experience, rather than simple custodial service. But Rodriguez's trained eye had noticed details about Frank's knife that would transform casual observation into recognition of authentic combat experience. Rodriguez's examination of Frank's K-bar revealed wear patterns and modifications that only extended combat use could create, indicating authentic field experience rather than ceremonial or training application that most base personnel possessed. "That blade's seen real work," Rodriguez observed while noting edge geometry and handle wear consistent with survival tool rather than display piece. Frank's modest response concealed extensive combat history. Picked up few techniques over the years, not mentioning jungle warfare that had required daily knife maintenance for survival tasks. Rodriguez's growing interest reflected recognition that civilian Janitor possessed military experience worthy of respect rather than casual dismissal that most Marines showed toward base maintenance personnel. The conversation attracted attention from other Marines conducting weapons training who began observing Frank's knife with professional interest that recognized authentic military equipment rather than civilian imitation or surplus store purchase. "Where did you serve?" Corporal Martinez asked, while Frank's response remained characteristically understated, "Vietnam, long time ago," not elaborating about combat operations or unit assignments that younger Marines might find historically interesting. His reluctance to discuss military background stemmed from decades of civilian reception that had made Vietnam service something to minimize rather than celebrate through sharing experiences with current military personnel who might. Frank's minimal responses about Vietnam service created curiosity among gathering Marines whose questions revealed growing recognition that base Janitor possessed combat experience exceeding that of most active duty personnel currently preparing for first deployments. "What unit were you with?" Lance Corporal Johnson inquired, while Frank's discomfort with attention became obvious despite Marines' respectful interest in his background. His decades of invisibility were ending as military personnel began processing discovery that civilian employee possessed authentic combat credentials, rather than civilian assumptions about maintenance worker whose military knowledge came from sources other than actual service and combat operations requiring survival skills and tactical expertise. The growing group of Marines around Frank's position created attention from base personnel who rarely witnessed civilian employees receiving extended interaction from active duty personnel whose professional interest suggested unusual circumstances requiring investigation. Base security observed unusual gathering around maintenance worker, creating potential concern about civilian employee receiving military attention that might indicate security issue rather than professional recognition of veteran status that base records had never properly documented. "What's the situation with the janitor?" Master Sergeant Williams inquired while observing Marines clustered around Frank whose obvious discomfort with attention contrasted with respectful interest from personnel recognizing authentic military experience rather than civilian employment status. Unit leadership began approaching scene to assess situation involving civilian employee who had attracted Marine attention through circumstances that remained unclear but suggested potential significance beyond routine maintenance interactions that typically characterized civilian-military relations on base. Frank's emotional response to unexpected recognition created visible stress as decades of invisibility suddenly transformed into military attention that Vietnam reception had taught him to avoid rather than embrace through sharing experiences that younger generations might not understand or appreciate appropriately. The convergence of military interest, command attention, and Frank's psychological discomfort created crisis requiring careful management to prevent misunderstanding while enabling appropriate recognition of veteran whose service deserved acknowledgement rather than continued invisibility. Facing unexpected military attention while managing decades of suppressed Vietnam memories tested Frank's psychological preparation for recognition that societal reception had taught him to avoid rather than embrace through sharing combat experiences with younger Marines. Rodriguez's respectful interest forced Frank to confront his assumptions about current generation's reception of Vietnam veterans, challenging self-protective isolation that had prevented meaningful interaction with military community, that his civilian employment had positioned him to serve. His response to growing Marine attention revealed character development. Through civilian service, he maintained dignity, while processing recognition, balanced humility against authentic military experience, and prioritized educational opportunity over personal comfort with publicity that his service deserved. The confrontation crystallized Frank's understanding of generational change. Current Marines respected combat experience regardless of controversial war context, while his knowledge could benefit personnel preparing for deployments requiring survival skills that his experience had mastered. Frank's military identity strengthened under recognition, reminding him that his service retained value despite civilian reception, and that his expertise could help current Marines through sharing knowledge that combat experience had provided, but institutional training couldn't replicate. His K-bar became symbol of continuity rather than concealment, representing Marine Corps tradition that connected generations of warriors through shared commitment to mission accomplishment and taking care of Marines regardless of temporal separation. As Frank's Vietnam service became known through Marines' persistent questions, the situation approached transformation that would either validate his decades of concealment or prove that current military generation respected combat veterans regardless of war's political reception. His growing emotional response to recognition suggested approaching breakdown of psychological barriers that had protected him from civilian hostility, while preventing connection with military community that might appreciate rather than dismiss his combat experience. The gathering Marines represented opportunity for knowledge transfer between combat veteran and deploying personnel. But Frank's psychological preparation for continued invisibility hadn't included strategies for managing positive recognition from respectful military audience. Rodriguez's leadership in recognizing Frank's authenticity created momentum for broader acknowledgement that could either overwhelm reclusive veteran or provide validation that decades of service suppression had prevented through protective isolation. The convergence of military recognition, command attention, and Frank's emotional vulnerability created perfect conditions for either psychological healing through acceptance or breakdown from unexpected attention that his coping mechanisms weren't designed to handle appropriately. His response to Marine Corps recognition would determine whether Vietnam service could finally receive appropriate acknowledgement or whether protective concealment would prevent meaningful connection with military community that valued his experience and expertise. And then everything changed when Frank's emotional barriers cracked and 40 years of suppressed Marine Corps pride finally found its voice. Frank's psychological defenses collapsed when Master Sergeant Williams arrived to investigate the gathering and immediately recognized Vietnam service ribbons that Frank had sewn inside his coveralls, creating emotional crisis that 40 years of concealment couldn't prevent when military authority demanded explanation. "Marine, why aren't you wearing your decorations?" Williams asked, while Frank's concealed Bronze Star and Purple Heart became visible during uniform inspection that revealed combat honors he'd hidden from civilian co-workers who might not understand their significance. The situation exploded emotionally when Frank attempted explanation through tears he hadn't shed since Tommy's death. "Sir came home to protesters calling us baby killers, learned to keep Vietnam service quiet to avoid problems with employment and civilian acceptance." Williams' response demonstrated generational healing Marine, that reception was wrong then, and we know it now. Your service deserves recognition, not concealment from people who didn't understand what you accomplished protecting American freedom. Frank faced complete breakdown of protective barriers. As assembled Marines processed his decades of hidden service, while their respectful attention challenged every assumption about civilian reception that had shaped his post-military identity through protective invisibility. Lost my best friend Tommy Nguyen on final patrol, Frank revealed, while Marines listened to combat experience, that their training had prepared them to understand and respect rather than judge through political contexts that had complicated Vietnam reception. The crisis transcended individual recognition to involve institutional healing between forgotten veterans and current military generation that understood service value regardless of war's political complexity or civilian reception that had failed to honor combat sacrifice appropriately. Standing surrounded by respectful Marines, while Master Sergeant Williams waited for response about concealed decorations, Frank confronted fundamental choice between continued protective concealment or acceptance of recognition that current military generation offered without the hostility he'd experienced from civilian society. The safe choice was retreat, explain decorations as family mementos, minimize Vietnam service significance, and return to invisible civilian employment that had protected him from potential discrimination or unwanted attention from communities that might still harbor negative attitudes. But Frank realized that Marines' respectful attention represented healing opportunity that decades of concealment had prevented, while his combat experience could benefit personnel preparing for deployments requiring survival knowledge that his service had mastered through necessity. If I keep hiding, I dishonor Tommy and every Marine who didn't come home, Frank thought, while Williams waited for explanation about combat decorations. These Marines deserve to learn from someone who survived what they might face in combat operations. His decision crystallized around duty to fallen comrades. Tommy's sacrifice demanded recognition through sharing experiences that could help current Marines, while continued concealment betrayed promises to remember those who hadn't returned from Vietnam. The ultimate stakes transcended personal protection to involve institutional memory. Whether Vietnam combat experience would die with aging veterans or transfer to current generation through honest discussion about warfare realities that training couldn't completely replicate. Frank's choice would determine not just his own psychological healing, but broader military understanding of Vietnam service value, despite political controversy that had obscured combat accomplishments deserving recognition rather than concealment from communities that benefited from such sacrifice. Frank made the choice that would transform his civilian invisibility into Marine Corps recognition, complete honesty about Vietnam service, while accepting respect that current generation offered without the hostility that had forced his concealment. Master Sergeant, I'm Frank Morrison, former Lance Corporal, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, Vietnam, 1969 to 1971. Bronze Star for Valor, Purple Heart for wounds received during combat operations that killed my best friend, Tommy Nguyen. Frank announced with military bearing that decades of civilian work couldn't eliminate. His transformation from concealed veteran to acknowledged Marine created immediate atmospheric change as assembled personnel recognized authentic combat experience, while Frank processed recognition he'd avoided for 40 years through protective invisibility. But Frank's revelation required confronting suppressed grief. Tommy died in my arms during final patrol when enemy fire prevented helicopter extraction. I promised to remember his sacrifice, but civilian reception made that memory something to hide rather than honor. Marine, your promise to remember fallen comrades is exactly why we need to hear your experiences. Williams responded while validating Frank's service through institutional recognition that civilian society had failed to provide. Frank's courage in claiming his military identity had begun a healing process that required integration of combat trauma with current service to military community that valued his experience and knowledge. This was the moment where concealed honor met open recognition, and Frank's Vietnam service would finally receive the respect it had always deserved. As Frank's Vietnam service became acknowledged by assembled Marines, he prepared for emotional discussion about combat experiences that 40 years of concealment had suppressed, while proving that current military generation respected rather than judged his controversial war service. His revelation enabled honest assessment of how combat knowledge could benefit current Marines preparing for deployments, where survival skills and tactical awareness that his experience had mastered could provide practical education that training scenarios couldn't replicate. 13 months in jungle conducting reconnaissance missions taught survival techniques and enemy tactics that might help Marines facing similar environments. Frank offered, while assembled personnel recognized valuable expertise rather than outdated experience requiring dismissal. Master Sergeant Williams' coordinated response that honored Frank's service while utilizing his knowledge. Marine, we'd like you to share experiences with personnel preparing for deployment. Your combat expertise could save lives through lessons that only battlefield experience can teach. Frank's psychological preparation included accepting recognition as validation rather than exposure, transforming protective concealment into educational opportunity that honored Tommy's memory while serving current Marines who needed practical knowledge from authentic combat experience. The gathering Marines represented opportunity for healing through service that integrated Vietnam experience with current military mission rather than treating his knowledge as historical curiosity without contemporary relevance. The moment of Frank's complete acceptance created intense atmosphere as Marines processed 40 years of hidden service while understanding that their janitor possessed combat experience exceeding that of most base personnel currently preparing for first deployments. Tommy Nguyen wanted to be teacher after Marine Corps service. Frank began while describing fallen friend whose memory had motivated decades of promised remembrance that civilian hostility had forced into concealment rather than celebration. Williams' response demonstrated institutional evolution. Marine Tommy's sacrifice and your survival create obligation to share knowledge that could save current Marines facing similar dangers. Your experience honors his memory through teaching rather than silence. The assembled Marines recognized profound moment as forgotten. Vietnam veteran received overdue recognition while their respectful attention proved generational healing that political controversy had prevented for decades after war's end. Jungle warfare taught lessons about survival enemy tactics and brotherhood that peacetime training can only approximate. Frank continued while providing educational context for combat knowledge that current operations might require. base personnel began gathering as word spread about Vietnam veteran whose combat experience had remained hidden despite years of civilian employment at installation where his expertise could have enhanced training and historical understanding of Marine Corps tradition. Frank's complete emergence as recognized Vietnam veteran created transformation in base dynamics as Marines processed discovery that civilian Janitor possessed combat credentials exceeding those of most active duty personnel preparing for combat deployments. First lesson: jungle warfare requires constant vigilance because enemy can be anywhere, including places you think are secure. Frank instructed, while assembled Marines listened to practical knowledge that training scenarios couldn't provide through classroom instruction alone. His description of Vietnam tactics and survival techniques demonstrated expertise that current counterinsurgency operations could benefit from when adapted to contemporary combat environments requiring similar awareness and tactical flexibility. Tommy and I learned to read, terrain assess civilian populations, and identify threats that conventional training hadn't prepared us for. Frank continued while providing context for lessons that combat necessity had taught through experience rather than theoretical study. The Marines recognized valuable educational opportunity as Frank's knowledge bridged historical and contemporary military operations through shared challenges that different conflicts presented to personnel requiring practical rather than academic understanding of warfare realities. Frank's teaching created immediate complications as his emotional processing of Tommy's death occurred while providing tactical education that required clinical assessment of combat realities without allowing personal grief to compromise instructional value for current Marines. Tommy died because we couldn't establish secure landing zone for medical evacuation, Frank explained while demonstrating how personal loss had taught lessons about tactical planning and risk assessment that current Marines needed to understand for their own survival. His integration of grief with education created powerful learning environment where personal sacrifice provided context for tactical knowledge that textbook instruction couldn't replicate through emotional authenticity that combat experience had created. Williams recognized Frank's teaching potential while managing psychological impact of sharing suppressed memories. Marine, your experiences provide education that could save lives, but we need to ensure appropriate support for processing trauma. That teaching might trigger. The balance between educational value and psychological support required careful management as Frank's decades of concealment had created emotional barriers that recognition was helping to heal through purposeful application of combat knowledge. The climactic moment arrived when Frank was invited to serve as guest of honor at upcoming Marine Corps birthday celebration, transforming hidden veteran into honored member of military community that had always been his rightful place. Frank Morrison, you are invited to represent Vietnam Marines at our birthday ceremony as recognition for service that deserves celebration rather than concealment, Williams announced while assembled Marines demonstrated respect through formation that acknowledged his combat credentials. Frank's emotional response revealed impact of institutional recognition. Sir, I haven't worn dress blues since 1971, when civilian reception made uniform something to avoid rather than wear with pride in communities that didn't understand our service. The invitation represented complete reversal of Frank's relationship with military identity, converting decades of concealment into celebration that honored both his service and Tommy's sacrifice through community recognition rather than individual isolation. Tommy would be proud to know his memory-inspired teaching that helps current Marines. Frank realized while accepting invitation that transformed protective invisibility into purposeful visibility, serving military community that valued his experience. Williams' presentation of honorary recognition demonstrated institutional healing. Marine, your service always deserved this respect. Current generation understands what previous civilian reception failed to acknowledge about Vietnam's sacrifice. The moment crystallized Frank's understanding that concealment had prevented rather than enabled healing, while recognition created opportunities for meaningful service that honored fallen comrades through education rather than silent remembrance. Frank's acceptance of recognition created complete transformation of his military identity, while establishing ongoing role as mentor and historian whose combat experience could enhance current Marine training and understanding of core values. His integration with active duty community provided healing through service that converted individual trauma into collective education benefiting personnel who needed practical knowledge from authentic combat experience rather than theoretical instruction. Tommy's memory lives through lessons I can teach about survival, brotherhood, and sacrifice. Frank concluded while planning educational programs that would honor fallen friend through knowledge transfer rather than silent grief. The breakthrough extended beyond individual recognition to institutional improvement, as Frank's Vietnam experience enhanced current training while bridging generational gap between forgotten veterans and active duty Marines who could benefit from historical perspective. His successful transition from concealed civilian to acknowledged veteran proved that healing occurred through integration rather than separation, while his teaching role provided purpose that transformed trauma into meaningful contribution to military community. Frank's recognition created immediate integration with Marine community, as his combat experience became valuable resource for training and mentorship, while his psychological healing accelerated through purposeful application of suppressed knowledge and memories. Williams arranged formal consultation role that utilized Frank's expertise while providing structure for sharing experiences that could benefit current Marines preparing for deployments requiring survival skills and tactical awareness. Most importantly, Frank's transformation from concealed veteran to honored Marine proved that recognition and service could heal trauma while honoring fallen comrades through education that served living Marines rather than silent remembrance alone. But Frank's recognition was just the beginning of transformation that would prove Vietnam expertise could enhance current Marine training while healing generational wounds. Frank's recognition triggered immediate integration of Vietnam combat experience into base training programs, as his tactical knowledge and survival expertise enhanced preparation for Marines deploying to environments requiring practical skills that classroom instruction couldn't provide effectively. Master Sergeant Williams established formal mentorship program utilizing Frank's experience, while his psychological healing accelerated through purposeful teaching that transformed suppressed trauma into educational service, benefiting current military personnel who needed historical perspective. The Marine Corps birthday celebration featured Frank as honored guest, while his dress blues returned from 4 decades of concealment to public recognition that Vietnam service had always deserved, but civilian reception had prevented through political hostility. Base personnel began recognizing other civilian employees who might possess military experience worthy of acknowledgement, while Frank's story influenced policies regarding veteran utilization and recognition within military installations employing former service members. Frank's K-Bar became teaching tool demonstrating equipment care and tactical application, while his integration with active duty community provided model for healing through service rather than isolation from military culture that had shaped his identity. 2 years later, Frank's influence on Marine training extended throughout the Corps, as his Vietnam experience became integrated curriculum for personnel preparing for counterinsurgency operations requiring survival skills and tactical awareness that jungle warfare had perfected through combat necessity. The Morrison method became standard approach for utilizing veteran expertise in current training, while Frank's story influenced military policies regarding recognition and integration of older veterans whose experience could enhance contemporary operations through historical perspective and practical knowledge. His mentorship program expanded to include other Vietnam veterans whose suppressed expertise could benefit current Marines while providing healing through purposeful service that honored fallen comrades through education rather than silent remembrance. Tommy Nguyen Memorial Training Center became facility for advanced survival and tactics instruction, while Frank's teaching honored his friend's memory through knowledge transfer that saved current Marines facing similar dangers. The case influenced veteran services programs while demonstrating healing through integration rather than separation, proving that recognition and purposeful service could transform trauma into meaningful contribution to military community that benefited from historical experience. Frank evolved from concealed veteran to honored Marine whose Vietnam experience enhanced current training, while his psychological healing through teaching demonstrated that trauma could become purposeful service when properly recognized and integrated. His relationship with Tommy's memory transformed from painful concealment to celebratory education as sharing combat knowledge honored fallen friend through practical application that helped living Marines rather than silent grief alone. Tommy's sacrifice teaches current Marines about brotherhood and survival. Frank often explains to mentorship students, his memory serves through knowledge that saves lives rather than trauma that prevents healing and service to military community. Frank's story proves that concealed trauma can become purposeful service when recognition enables healing through integration rather than separation, while demonstrating that veteran expertise remains valuable regardless of war's political context when properly acknowledged and utilized for current military benefit. Epilogue. Today, Frank Morrison serves as Senior Combat Instructor at Camp Pendleton's Advanced Tactical Training Center, where his Vietnam experience trains thousands of Marines annually, while his psychological healing continues through teaching that honors Tommy Nguyen's memory. His K-Bar remains prominently displayed in his office, alongside Tommy's photograph and Bronze Star citation symbols of service that concealment had hidden, but recognition finally celebrates. Master Sergeant Williams now, Sergeant Major, credits Frank with revolutionizing practical combat training, while his mentorship program has expanded to include Vietnam veterans throughout the Corps, whose expertise enhances current operations. The janitor's closet, where Frank stored cleaning supplies for 4 decades, now serves as memorial office, where he counsels Marines facing deployment stress while sharing survival knowledge that jungle warfare taught through necessity. His story influences veteran integration programs while proving that healing occurs through purposeful service rather than protective isolation from military communities that benefit from experienced guidance. The Marine Corps birthday celebration, where Frank first wore dress blues after 40 years, has become annual tradition, honoring forgotten veterans whose expertise serves current warriors through teaching that transforms trauma into triumph, demonstrating that true healing comes not from forgetting painful memories, but from transforming them into meaningful service that honors the fallen while protecting the living through knowledge that experience alone can provide to those who carry on the mission of taking care of Marines across generations, united by honor, courage, and commitment to those who serve and those who remember.